Welcome again to Federico Giusfredi and Valerio Pisaniello. The title of their talk today is the acht Sprachen der Boghazköi-Inschriften, a little more than a century after. Federico and Valerio, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to share my screen and let's see if I can do it properly. Okay, now Control L. Okay, you should be seeing my screen in full screen now.
Yeah.
Okay, very well. So, good evening, everybody. And first of all, we obviously wish to thank the Association for the Archaeological Research in Western and Central Asia and the organizers of these webinars for having us today, and also everyone who is attending for being virtually here with us. The title of our talk, as many of you already know, is probably everybody knows that, is a quote from the title of a rather famous article published by Emile Forer in 1919. And equally famous and well-known is probably the fact that the archives, collection, and depots of tablets found in the Hittite capital city exhibit an unusual level of what I would call corpus multilingualism. Indeed, there are not 8, but at least 10 languages that are recorded and have been recognized today in the cuneiform tablets found in Boğazöy, Hattusha. 8 of these have been known for over 1 century. 1 was identified a few decades ago and is still entirely elusive or almost entirely elusive, so we are not going to say much about it. And the last one was discovered in the last season's excavation, so data are not yet available, but it makes 10 already. Okay. So collection of cuneiform texts emerged from quite a few different spots of the rather large archaeological site of Hattusha, both in the so-called upper town and in the lower one. And the areas of interest are generally the big temple, or temple 1, the palace, or the Büyükale Acropolis, the house on the slope, more frequently named in German Haus am Hang, and Westbau of the Nishan Tepe area, and temples and the other temples. And the picture on the right illustrates the rather complex composition of the Hittite palace at Büyükale. The position of the tablets is a very interesting topic too, but we're not going to be able to discuss it today. And while some collections seem to be connected to specific stages of the Hittite history or to specific phases of the scribal work in the city, many features of the archives are still debated and definitely very, very complex. Now, while Hattusha remains the place that produced the largest collections of cuneiform texts, archives and collections were found also in other sites in central Anatolia. And archives of northern Syria were also connected to the Hittite administrative and scribal praxis to some extent, especially during the imperial phase of the Hittite kingdom, during what Itamar Zinger called the Pax Hittitica, for obvious historical reason connected to the influence that the Hittite empire projected over these regions. Interestingly, some of the other archives also exhibit some level of multilingualism, but it is not as layered and complex as those in Hattusha. Quite surprisingly, for instance, one language that we only find in Hattusha is Luvian, which is considered, on the other hand, by a large part of the scholarship to have been the most widely spoken one, or at least the most widely spoken Anatolian language of the late Bronze Age. So it's quite tricky that it doesn't emerge more diffusely. Akkadian, Hurrian, Hattian, and Hittite, on the other hand, are generally represented also outside of the capital city in other epigraphically active sites that you can see in this map. The map is taken from the volume that Sergio quoted, Contacts of Languages and People in the Hittite and Post-Hittite World, which was published a few months ago, 6 months ago roughly, and contains part of the results of a long project that we have been carrying out in the past few years at Verona University. Okay, and all the pictures that I'm projecting mostly come from this, at least the maps come from this publication. All right, now, when we speak of the Hattusha archives, which are probably better defined as collection of texts, because it's a more neutral term, and the definition of archive is quite problematic, as was pointed out by several scholars. I was rereading today some of the initial chapters of Shai Gordin's book about scribes in Hattusha, and of course, it's pretty clear that archive is a very daring definition for a collection whose function is not always clear. Anyway, we refer only to cuneiform texts today, so we are not going to discuss the hieroglyphic Luwian inscription, even though they are very important also historically, but also sociolinguistically. I think Valerio will show a picture of one of those, but I don't think we are going to enter the topic of this different and secondary form of literacy. Now, paleographically speaking, cuneiform used by the Hittite has long been recognized as being similar to the one used in PALaC 7, and so the old Babylonian levels of the PALaC site, with, of course, then an internal development that will take place in Hatti, with a distinction between older and later ducti, and several different types, especially for the later ones. There are also other ducti that are represented in the collection. This is quite interesting. We have the Mitannian, the Assyro-Mitannian, if it exists, that's debated too, the Assyrian, and also the Middle Babylonian ducti that emerge in the tablets, and also some so-called mixed ducti that emerge at least in two different types of documents, to my knowledge, and should probably require a larger deal of scholarly attention to be better defined in the coming years. Anyway, a few texts in Hattusha also go back to the Karun age, which is obviously older and goes back to an Assyrian scribal tradition. We are not going to discuss this today either. Paleography, however, is of some importance because it allows us to pinpoint the distribution of the text into the different stages of the Hittite scribal praxis. Minority of texts are those that exhibit a old Hittite ductus, relative minority. There are not few, but there are not as many as the later ones. Even though the meaning of the old Hittite ductus has been harshly debated by the specialists, but still they are certainly relatively older than the later ones. Some exhibit a Middle Hittite ductus, roughly corresponding to the 15th and early 14th century. And finally, the majority is the New Hittite ductus, or actually the different New Hittite ducti that distribute over the phase that starts with the empire proper, so second half of the 14th century to the early 12th. And throughout all these phases, the texts that were found in Hattusha have one important thing in common, and that is they are all official documents of some sort. I mean, not necessarily the original version or the official version of an official document, but they are always related to the court or to the official cult or to the highest level of administration. It is no longer true what we used to say that no administrative text exists from Anatolia, but it is still true that collections of private administrative documents, think of marriage contracts or those kind of texts that you find abundantly in Mesopotamia, these don't really came out from the depots we find in Anatolia. And now let's move to the languages. I'm sorry, I misclicked. Okay, here. So as for the languages that the scribes of the Hittite kingdom mastered and recorded using cuneiform, there's a list in the slide. This is just a list. I'm going to read it out loud. And the left part of the slide is the list that Farah would have known: Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, Sumerian, Luwian, Hattian, PALaC, and Indo-Aryan. And then there are the new mysterious one. One is the new much favored language of Kalasma. We are all waiting to see this tablet that records this new apparently Indo-European language that has been discovered in the last excavation of the city. We are very thrilled. And then we have the language of text KBO 29-164, which is a strange text that features a language that seems to be agglutinative. There is trace of prefixing and suffixing morphology, and we really don't understand it. It's been known for quite a few years now. Carlo Corti published a work on it in Abu in 2003, and I think that the linguist David Saspiel has made new hypotheses in Istanbul this year at the Hittite conference. We will wait for his results and hypotheses to be published. And then we have one that is perhaps a language is mentioned in a text. There's a text that is KUB 58.5, where at some point a line goes like they sing Tagore Kumneli, so they sing in the way of Tagorka, and this could be a reference to a language, but of course, in the way of Tagorka does not necessarily mean that we're referring to a language. This could also be a reference to the way of singing or to some feature of the music, just like the Greek Lydisti referred to the Lydian way in the late Greek glosses does not always mean in Lydian, it can also mean in the Lydian musical style. So we cannot really say for sure if there is an 11th language that is at least mentioned in the archives. But still, the situation is quite rich and fascinating. And of course, lists are nice, but lists don't tell you much about the things that we are listing. So we can try to classify the languages, and a very standard way would be to use the typical ways of classifying languages you're finding in the European studies. So Hittite, Luwian, and PALaC would belong together because they are genealogically related. Akkadian and Sumerian, they are areally related. They are the Mesopotamian languages. Hurrian and Hattian are isolated, but they, of course, they don't share a properly similar status in Hattusha. Indo-Aryan is a language that is only present in loanwords and probably enters from a Mitannian cultural milieu, and it's quite enigmatic because it is an Indo-Iranian language, but it's not Iranian, it's Indian, so it must come from pretty far east. And then, of course, there are the two languages that have been recently discovered, and I cannot say much about them, so I will just do as Wittgenstein suggested, and I'm going not to say anything about what I cannot comment on. But of course, just making a list that is based on superficial areal or genealogical classifications is not particularly interesting. And what is more interesting is to try to understand the different status, sociolinguistic status and function of the languages in the city. And this is interesting because the results become much more complex and much more interesting. And then we have Akkadian and Sumerian. They do indeed belong together to some extent, at least because they are the learned languages of Mesopotamia. They don't really share the same functions, but they might share some. Hittite is the local official language, obviously, and it exhibits little but some degree of variation in its written form, and certainly changes diachronically until the very end of the life of the collection of texts in Hattusha. Luwian is clearly the very important and very widespread Anatolian language. It becomes increasingly present in the core of the Hittite kingdom during the final centuries, but even here we will try to comment a little on the current state of the art. Hurrian is the language of myths and rituals. Its presence is mostly connected to the, I would say, almost episodic presence of an elite of Hurrians starting within the 15th, 14th century BCE. Hattian is an old local language that coexisted with Hittite for centuries. I'm sorry, I have to go back. What's happening here? Yep. With some religious and cultural relevance, possibly still spoken for at least part of the Hittite history. PALaC is genealogically Anatolian. It's also an old local language of culture, and it has pretty close areal relationship with Hattian, so it shares something with Hattian from a cultural point of view. Indo-Aryan is a marginally attested language present only in indirect loanwords, and of course, I cannot say much about the two new ones. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start commenting on the first element of the list in the previous slide. I'm showing it once again. So I will say something about the status of the two main Mesopotamian languages, learned Mesopotamian languages in Hittite Anatolia, and then I will leave the stage to Valerio Pisaniello for a presentation of the other languages and their relevant study. Sumerian was a dead language. Sumerian is is clearly a dead language by the time it is recorded in Hattusha, but it's not an extinct one, meaning that Sumerian texts during the second and the first millennium BCE were still copied. There were original compositions to some extent, and the Assyriologists in the room certainly know this much better than me. In Hattusha, the language is attested in different types of texts, which are lexical lists, of course, that are, well, generally Valerio and I had the impression that there was quite an important work of re-elaboration and reworking in the Hittite area, and the Hittite lexical lists, of course, were reworked at least to the point that Hittite entries were added to the material. And Sumerian, of course, emerges in lexical lists, but it also emerges in incantations and in literary texts. And in this case, the dukti are distributed in an interesting fashion. This is taken from several works, actually, by Professor Maurizio Biano, who was the person who, the expert who collaborated with my project for the problem of Sumerian in Hattusha, and one of the biggest experts around. And interestingly, we have Hittite new script, mostly used for literary text, while Mesopotamian dukti tend to prevail in incantations. This is probably indicative of some features of the way the texts were produced, but I am not capable of provide any further insight into this. And those that were literary texts and that were copied locally reached Hattusha at different times, apparently, but generally reflect a stage that is successive diachronically to the Old Babylonian one. So to some extent, they represent a photograph of the Middle Babylonian stage of the cultural tradition, apparently, which is quite important because of the distribution of what we know about the Middle Babylonian cultural tradition. And the habit of phonetic writing is quite common in the Hattusha text, so writing Sumerian in a way that is not properly orthographic, but mimics and tries to render the phonetics, the phonetic value of the signs employed. This is something that also emerges in Hattusha. And if I understood correctly what has been explained to me by people who know better, this would be something that patterns with a known Old Babylonian tradition, with something more peripheral with respect to the Mesopotamian core of the diffusion. All right. But if the synchronic status of Sumerian in Hattusha is basically that of a learned dead language, the case of the other main Mesopotamian language, Akkadian, is more complex and, in my opinion, definitely fascinating. Okay. Now, the term Boghazköi-Akkadian has been frequently used in literature for quite a long time now, and not yet a century, but almost. And it was quite frequently used to indicate a specific variety or grapholect, to borrow a very interesting technical term that is also used by Lisa Guilherme in her 2011 doctoral dissertation. We believe that it would probably be more appropriate to think of different grapholects of Akkadian in Hattusha that should be distinguished because of their different functions and to some extent of different features. And all of them share something in common, but what they share are mostly the peculiar peripheral and to some extent non-fully grammatical linguistic features that all derive from a common substrate. But the fact that all the grapholects of Akkadian that we find in Boghazköy reflect the same sociolinguistic substrate of an Anatolian speaker does not imply, of course, that they all represent the same type of Akkadian or that the language had the same function in all of these texts. And you can see from the scheme that you distinguish, at least for subcorpora, which are the Akkadian of the old Hittite political text, the Akkadian of the land grants, the Akkadian of diplomacy, of course, and then Akkadian of the cultural production. And I will briefly comment on what we mean with these four categories, which are, of course, duly discussed in our recent book that was already mentioned twice. So the earliest production of all Hittite documents in Akkadian within the collection of Hattusha should begin around the time of the reign of Hattusili I. Paleographically, the syllabary used in Boghazköy with minor or document-specific exceptions, which I cannot comment upon right now is close, as I said, to the Old Babylonian syllabary that is using PALaC 7. And except for a couple of aberrant texts, the old Hittite political documents tend to use Hittite ductus. Old Babylonian, with infiltrations that may point to Syrian interference. They were detected quite early in scholarship. You can find the list not only in our works, but also in Wilhelm's dissertation, but also in De Vecchis edition of the Akkadian version of the Annals of Hattusili. Okay, and this Syrian interference is indicative, possibly, of the cultural origin of the reintroduction of the language as a communication vehicle of some sort. The Assyrianizing forms that may connect it with the earlier Old Assyrian phase are extremely limited, not completely absent, but extremely limited. And limited, but definitely present, are also the phenomena of substrate interference from Hittite. However, these extend to some formulaic calques, such as, for instance, some constructions in the Akkadian version of Pelipinus edict, which demonstrates that Akkadian should not be just regarded as the original language that was used to write the original version of these documents for obvious prestige reasons, but probably some bilingual texts were simply conceived as bilingual documents for this plain reason, also in a big grapholectal scribal environment in which the adaptation of cuneiform to Hittite was still an ongoing process, even though I belong to the, I don't know if minority or majority of scholars who believe that this adaptation occurred pretty early. Peculiar group of documents that are more easily dated than the old Hittite political texts are the land grants, however. And while some of these are not particularly older than the earliest diplomatic documents, there are different linguistic features. And namely, we have limited influence from Hittite, so foreignisms that are morphologically inflected in Hittite are present, and possibly there is also some grammatical interference, but it's different type of interference than in the old Hittite political text. And in general, the language is a form of Old Babylonian that also features some formulaic constructions that seems to be connected to Assyrian tradition. So this data point to not a complete continuity, but a sort of prosecution of the linguistic and cultural tradition closer to that of the old Hittite political text. But what is interesting is that chronologically, some of the land grants are not very far from the earliest diplomatic texts. And as for diplomacy, treaties and letters make up the largest corpus of local productions in Akkadian. And treaties are historically datable, but the tablets on which treaties are recorded are generally later copies. There is a possibility that treaty between Tahuwaili and Ahia might be an original, but this has been doubted recently quite convincingly, so I'm not really sure that we should trust this. And in the case of letters, it's a little more difficult to establish if one is dealing with an original or with a copy, and speculation are mostly based on circumstantial information in this case, but linguistically letters are still very, very charming materials. And indeed, if treaties are in general written in international Akkadian, letters tend to be also written in a similar language, but they exhibit idiosyncratic features. And so in the case of Assyrian letters exchanged between Hittites and Assyrians, for instance, Mora and Georgieri already noticed in 2004 that we found Assyrianisms not only in the letters from Assur, but also in the letters written in Hatti to Assur, which probably demonstrates a learning of the vernacular of that specific communication by the scribes who composed the letters. Okay. Substrate grammatical interference is also very evident in letters. We have inverted genitives, presence of the U conjunction of Akkadian that is way too frequent and probably calques the connective of Hittite. So these are texts that seem to exhibit a very strong type of substrate presence. And the last type of Akkadian that we mentioned is that of the cultural tradition, and this is something that we wanted to include in our work. It's not always the case. The documents that fall under this category are not always considered pertinent to the study of Boghazköi-Akkadian, because it is debatable how local they should be considered. We have lists, hymn, literary texts, magic, medical texts, rituals, incantations, and they probably stem from the Middle Babylonian stage of the tradition that is famously known better than from peripheral archives. And the language reflects those of the traditions of origin, of course, but there are hints that the text were occasionally re-elaborated locally and perhaps in some cases also translated into Hittite. The presence of Anatolian glosses, which are generally written in a variety of Hittite that is strongly influenced by Luwian, is of particular importance. And as Valerio and I argued in a couple of recent articles, they may reflect the sociolinguistic background of the scribes and specialists that contributed to the written tradition of these documents. The Dukti are quite confusing for this type of documents because we have Middle Babylonian, Assyro-Mitannian, Assyrian, Mitannian, Neo-Hittite, and also some mixed Dukti in the medical tradition. In general, it seems to us that the different functions of Akkadian result in and emerge from specific subcorpora, while common substrate phenomena are similar because the substrate, the Hittite-speaking scribes, the Luwian-speaking scribes, the local scribes, is the same. But this doesn't mean that the variety should be seen as more homogeneous than it is. I will now leave the stage to Valerio, so I mute myself and he will move on with the other languages in the Hittite corpus. So Valerio, I stop sharing and I mute myself and you have the stage.
Okay. Okay, hope you can see my presentation. Okay.
Yes, Valerio, yes.
So let's move to Hurrian. Hurrian is attested in rituals and mythological narratives belonging to the genre of songs, which were probably sung during the festival celebrations. Hurrian personal names are attested in Mesopotamian sources, at least since the kingdom of Naram-Sin. The earliest Hurrian dynasty, known from direct epigraphic sources, was located in the city of Urkesh in North Mesopotamia. During the Middle Bronze Age, the Hurrians spread toward northern Syria and possibly Cilicia, laying the ground for the possibility of contacts with the Anatolian people. In the late 16th or early 15th century BC, the kingdom of Mitanni emerged in northern Mesopotamia, with a dynasty featuring royal names and titles linguistically belonging to an Indo-Aryan superstrate, which contributed to the further spread of the Hurrian element to the west. As far as we currently know, Hurrian is genealogically related to Urartian only in the first millennium, and it is attested in at least two different chronological stages. There is an old Hurrian, a label generally including the varieties of language of the early dynasty of Urkesh and texts found in the Hittite archives and Syria, in contrast to the variety of the Mitanni letter, Mitanni Hurrian, which is one of the few Hurrian documents presumably written by the scribes of the kingdom of Mitanni during the reign of Tushratta. As far as Anatolia is concerned, a limited presence of Hurrian lexical elements and personal names can be already found in old Assyrian texts of the Kaf period, but it is impossible to establish whether the borrowing process occurred in Anatolia or in Assyria. Contacts between the Hittites and Hurrians are attested since the very beginning of the Hittite kingdom, but Hurrians came into intensive political contact with the kingdom of Hatti, beginning with the reign of Telipinu. Toward the mid-14th century, Tudkhali I married Nikalmadi, probably princess from Kizuatna. The penetration of most Hurrian ritual and literary texts, as well as Hurrian deities and cultic traditions, into Hatti should probably be dated to this period, and the process further intensified under the reign of Tudkhali III. Besides Hattusa, Hurrian texts relevant to the study of language contact in Hittite Anatolia were found at Ortaköy, the ancient Shapinua, Kayalpinar, the ancient Shamuha, and Ugarit. Based on paleographic data and contextual information, a chronology of Hurrian text in the Hittite archives was established by Giorgieri, and is summarized in this table. As can be seen, no Hurrian text can be safely dated to the Hittite Old Kingdom. The earliest Hurrian documentation in the Hittite archives consists of some Omen texts dated to the first half of the 15th century. The first significant wave of Hurrian documents reached Hattusa under the reigns of Tudkhali I and Arnuwanda I, and was related to the annexation of Kizuatna and the marriage of Tudkhali I with the princess Nikalmadi. To this period should also be dated the copy of the bilingual Song of Release, whose Hurrian text is, however, older, probably to be dated between the 17th and 16th centuries. This text, together with the wisdom texts known as parables, was probably part of a Hurrian scribal curriculum and probably was soon discarded after the Middle Hittite period. The purification rituals Ilahi and Itkalsi should be traced back to the beginning of the 14th century because they were originally composed for the marriage of Tudhaliya III and Taduepa, and later adapted into a generic ritual for any ritual patron. The bulk of mythological songs and their Hittite translations or adaptations can be dated to the Empire period between the 14th and 13th centuries, with very limited evidence for earlier tablets. A renewed interest in Hurrian religion can be found during the reign of Hattusili III, especially due to his wife Puduhepa, who was the daughter of a Kisuatnean priest. Particularly, to this reign can be safely dated the imperial version of the Hisua festival from Kisuatna, whose copy was commissioned by Puduhepa to the chief scribe Walwaziti. As far as can be judged from the available documentation, while Hurrian cultural traditions were widely accepted in central Anatolia and fully integrated into the Hittite state cult, the Hurrian language seems to have maintained a rather exotic status. During the reign of Tudhaliya I and until the reign of Tudhaliya III, we could assume a certain degree of knowledge of Hurrian, at least within the Hittite court. So one can explain, for example, the existence of a couple of fragments of edicts in the Hurrian language dated to the reign of Arnuanda I. But all the information we have for the later period points to an exclusively liturgical use of Hurrian, which does not imply a full competence of the language. Thus, mythological songs mostly circulated in Hittite translation. The Hisua festival included Hurrian recitations only in the first 3 or 4 tablets, while the others only included the recitations in Hittite. Hurrian incantations were found in ritual texts, generally full of mistakes, but the last recension of the ritual of Eleturahi from Mukish, dated to the reign of the last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, only displays Hittite translations in place of the Hurrian incantations included in the earlier versions. The marginal status of the Hurrian language is also evidenced by the very limited linguistic interference between Hurrian and the Hittite, which was essentially restricted to lexicon, limited to technical terms pertaining to the religious sphere, mediated by Luwian. Also, in the Akkadian medical text KUB 37.1, which includes a number of Anatolian glosses, the only 2 Hurrian glosses are explicitly marked as Hurlili, while Luwian and Hittite glosses are never explicitly indicated with a glottonym, which may further show the foreign status of Hurrian with respect to the Luwi-Hittite Koine. Structural similarities between Hittite and Hurrian can be explained, at best, as the result of process of areal convergence to be traced back to a very earlier stage, and not resulting from contacts between Hurrian and Hittite during the Hittite kingdom. Of course, the case of Kisuatna is different, because intensive contacts between Hurrian and Luwian can be assumed in this region, which also led to some phenomena of structural interference on Luwian. Now, turning to geographically Anatolian languages, Hattian also was a non-Indo-European language, currently an isolated language, which is only preserved by text copied and stored in the Hittite archives, and often provided with Hittite translations. They probably represented a canonical set of compositions because they are found in different Hittite centers. As far as can be seen from the available documentation, only incantations, mythological narratives related to ritual practices, and cultic songs sung during festivals in honor of the deities, Hattian language among the Hittites was restricted to cultic practices. Despite a huge religious and cultural influence of the Hattian element on the Hittite culture, the linguistic influence is rather limited, essentially only involving some lexical loanwords. No structural interference on Hittite can be detected. We should briefly mention, however, that a situation of language contact possibly resulted in some structural interference may have existed before the era of the Hittite kingdom. Hattian populations were in contact with Indo-European Anatolian speakers before or during the current period, and Gedegebure suggested a scenario of symbiosis between Hattian and Proto-Luwian speakers in order to explain some typological asymmetries in Hattian as the result of syntactic interference with Luwian. According to this scenario, the Hattian language known from the Hittite archives would be a language imperfectly learned by an originally non-Hattian speaking population that shifted to Hattian, which was a more prestigious language. However, it must be emphasized that unfortunately, data are currently not enough to confirm or reject such a hypothesis. Whether Hattian was still a living language during the Hittite kingdom is a quite debated issue. Of course, it was certainly in use for religious performances, so it was not an extinct language in a technical sense. Nevertheless, there is a general consensus that it was poorly understood, so it can be regarded perhaps as a dead language. However, as mentioned, our view on Hattian is limited to the cultic use the Hittites made of it, as a learned liturgical language, which may also have involved memorization of text rather than an actual competence of the language. But there is no evidence about the status of Hattian outside the Hittite religious practice, so we simply cannot tell whether it still was the native language of some communities during the Hittite period. Moving to the Indo-European group of Anatolian languages, PALaC, the Bronze Age Anatolian language with the most restricted corpus, is also only documented by text found in the Hittite archives, so our knowledge of this language is filtered by the Hittite scribal practice. The glottonym clearly refers to the land of Pala, somewhere in northern Anatolia, but we do not have any direct documentation coming from that area. PALaC texts are few, and their content is limited to religious practices, specifically to the cult of Ziparfa, the PALaC storm god, and therefore our knowledge of the language is rather limited, and we are not even able to establish its exact genealogical position within the Anatolian branch of Indo-European, which means that we cannot establish whether it was genealogically closer to Hittite or Luwian. As for language contact, no significant interference phenomena can be found between PALaC and both Hittite and Luwian. The only attested phenomena of interference are with Hattian, but they are probably limited to some lexical borrowings, all technical terms belonging to the lexicon of the ritual sphere, besides some divine names, which attest for a rather strong cultural connection between Palaians and Hattians. We cannot determine whether PALaC was a living language during the age of Hatti, or even in the Old Hittite age, to which the earliest manuscripts can be traced back, or rather a dead language, nor can we assess the degree of competence the Hittites had of it. We can only say for sure that based on the documentation currently available, PALaC was a foreign language in Apusa, only employed in religious and ritual contexts. And last, but not least, and actually the most relevant to the issue of language content in Bronze Age Anatolia, Luwian or Luwian varieties. Indeed, while it is obvious that a certain degree of dialectal or sociolectal variety must have existed for all the languages we are dealing with today, in practice, Luwian is the language in which this seems to be best observed. Although the Luwian corpus as a whole is much less extensive than the Hittite one, it is considerably less homogeneous, and a number of different varieties can be singled out according to different standpoints. The first macroscopic difference involves writing systems. Luwian is attested in two different writings, the cuneiform script of the Hittite type and a hieroglyphic system. As a consequence, scholars used to speak of two different Luwian varieties, namely cuneiform Luwian, including the language of the incantations found in Luwian rituals, and of the single words embedded in Hittite text, usually called glosses, and the hieroglyphic Luwian, that is the language of hieroglyphic inscriptions of the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. However, such a distinction proved to be incorrect linguistically when it became clear that the language of the Luwian words included in Hittite text was closer to the hieroglyphic variety than to that of the ritual incantations. So the classification was reconsidered by Jakubowicz, who distinguished between Kizzuatna Luwian, there is the Luwian variety of the ritual text, and Empire Luwian, there is the variety spoken in the Hittite capital city, Apusa, attested by single words included in Hittite text, and later by hieroglyphic inscriptions. Besides these two main dialects, both probably labeled as Luwili by the Hittites, the Hittite archives preserve a third Luwian variety, the Luwian of Istanua, called Istanunili, attested by quite obscure texts. And a fourth Luwian variety should have existed, that of Arzawa in Western Anatolia, but we only have some personal names and perhaps sporadic isolated lexemes in rituals from that region. So this was the picture of the Luwian varieties until recently. In 2021, Alice Mouton and Ilya Jakubowicz suggested a more fine-grained classification of the Luwian varieties based on different ritual traditions. In the reconstructions, three different ritual traditions can be identified. The tradition of the lower land, including the rituals ascribed to Tunawiya, Kuwatalla, and Puriyanni, the tradition of Kizuatna, including the ritual of Zarpiya, and the tradition of Taurisa, a town that should be located somehow northeast of Attusa. From a linguistic point of view, there seems to be no difference between the Luwian varieties found in rituals from Kizuatna and the lower land, even though one should mention that the amount of textual material associated with Kizuatna is extremely limited. Conversely, the Luwian variety of the Taurisa tradition would be distinguished from the one of Kizuatna and the lower land, according to Mouton and Jakubowicz, only by the extensive use of the quotative particle wa, which occurs only once in the Kizuatna corpus, and the presence of a variant qua. However, one should mention that 4 out of the 11 are assigned to the Taurisa tradition because of the very presence of wa, with an obvious risk of circularity. And the expansion and the functionalization of wa can be regarded as a diachronic development. In other words, as suggested by Giusfredi, lower land and Kizuatna Luwian on the one hand and Taurisa Luwian on the other hand may not be different synchronic Luwian dialects at the etopic level, but rather different diachronic stages of the same Luwian variety, which we may generically label as Luwian of the ritual tradition. Conversely, Empire Luwian was a markedly different variety, and the features that distinguish it from the Luwian one of the ritual tradition are both archaisms and innovations, as can be seen from the very simplified table you can see here. It is difficult, however, to establish to which extra-linguistic features the two sets of variants correlate. It could be a matter of diatopic variation, so the Luwian of Attusa versus the Luwian of the southern Anatolia, possibly later spread to the north, to Taurisa, or perhaps of diaphasic variation. On one hand, we would have a Luwian variety spoken in the Hittite capital city, occasionally surfacing in Hittite texts, and in a later stage employed in the monumental inscriptions of the last Hittite kings. And on the other hand, we would have a Luwian variety used for a specific religious purpose, a subcode specific to ritual text, which also does not need to be a living language. It is also possible that it was a dead language, only surviving in the ritual practices. As is clear from its survival, at least in the epigraphic practice, the collapse of the Hittite Empire, Luwian had a very different role from Hattian, Hurrian, and PALaC in the Hittite world. It was not merely a code exclusively employed in religious practices, and this is also evident when we consider the phenomenon of linguistic interference between Luwian and Hittite, which point to a long-lasting scenario of bilingualism in the Hittite court. Hittites and Luwians were already in contact in the Old Assyrian age, as emerges from the onomastics. Interference phenomena can be detected already in the early stages of the Hittite kingdom and consist of not only several lexical borrowings, but also some examples of morpheme induction. During the imperial period, Luwian influence on Hittite intensified, leading to a number of structural changes, especially in nominal and pronominal domains, such as the syncretism between the nominative and accusative plural in the nominal declension, thus matching the Empire Luwian inflection, and several changes in the declension of the independent and clitic pronouns, and also the introduction in Hittite of the Luwian pattern of the immutation. While the increasing influence of Luwian on Hittite led some scholars to suggest that Hittite was a dead language during the final stages of the Empire period, a Kanzleisprache only confined to the written dimension, this is by no means necessary. Structural changes characterizing the late Hittite, even though most probably triggered by Luwian, did not slavishly reproduce the Luwian model, but rather adapted it to the needs of the Hittite language, also opting for different solutions to those provided by the Luwian model, according to inner Hittite tendencies. Moreover, even non-standard texts such as the glosses found in Akkadian medical texts, while showing on one end that Luwian influence on Hittite was perhaps even more widespread than we see in official texts, on the other hand, exhibit an unequivocally Hittite grammatical structure, which makes it unlikely that Hittite was a dead language, and Luwian the only living one. So with this brief presentation, we hope to have provided an updated overview on the multilingual environment of ancient Anatolia under the Hittite kingdom, and on the current view on the status of the 8 languages, which currently number more than 8, identified by Forer a little more than a century ago, when Hittitology was in its beginnings. So thank you for your attention.